A serious house on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognised and robed as destinies. This is the first episode of Encounters with King's College Chapel. I'm Stephen Cherry, and my guest today is Sir Simon Jenkins, well known as journalist, enthusiast for church buildings, and most recently for writing a short history of British architecture, from Stonehenge to the Shard. Simon's a wonderful person to begin this series with. He must have visited more churches than anyone else in the country. His book is on the 1,000 best, but goodness knows how many he had to visit in order to come to that list. So here's a person who's absolutely in love with the sort of building that King's College Chapel is. I mean, ours is the epitome of late Gothic, and as you'll hear, Simon described himself as a Goth. Truly, it was a great conversation we had, and I want to share it with you now. I mean, maybe you'd like to listen to it while yourself walking around the chapel, or passing by, or sitting in a cafe in King's Parade looking at this edifice. Anyway, as I say, it was a great chat. The only thing was, just as we were about to begin, it started to rain. Here we are in the front court of King's College, Cambridge, just outside the Gibbs building, looking north at the south elevation of the chapel. Can I just ask you to respond to it in this moment? What do you see and what do you feel?
Well, I have to say, this is my favourite building in Britain. Okay,
Thank
so we're
you.
starting from square one. I don't mind which way we look at it. It just is a sensational building. Where we're standing now is very interesting because we've got the Gibbs building on the left. You've got the chapel ahead of us. The two great periods of English architecture, classical and Gothic, set bang next to each other, as if they're talking to each other. And because I'm a Goth rather than a classicist, but I appreciate classicism, I find the way they sit together really quite fascinating. They do talk to each other in a curious way, round a quadrangle. But to me, I have to say, the Gibbs building is sitting there, saying not very much. The chapel is just full of language. It's talking all the time. It's alive. You feel the people who are building it were sort of building it and thinking as they were doing so. They weren't looking at some pattern book. And you've got this amazing structure.
It is amazing, and it's also raining at the moment, so we're going to walk towards it quite quickly. But as we do, one of the advantages of it being a rainy day is that the coloration of the white and the yellow stone is more distinguished, so we can see more clearly on those buttresses there the earlier building program, which is white stone going up, 25, 30 feet, and gradually staggering down towards this end. So we get a sense of where the first building program ended. But it is raining quite heavily, so if we could talk perhaps a bit more inside.
Having taken it in, let's go in.
Yes. So we go straight through the porch and inside, and then let's see what it feels like when we're in the building itself.
One of the things I love about this chapel is there are two chapels. There's the daytime chapel and there's the evening chapel.
Yes.
And they are utterly different buildings, purely because of the way the light plays on the architecture. When I was last here, the windows were black because it was dark and late.
Yes.
But the light was coming from candles and hidden lights, and it was sort of electrifying rather than electric. But now we're looking at it in which the windows are just totally dominant. And even at this end, where I think they're Victorian,
the west window is Victorian, otherwise they're all from the much earlier period. Yeah.
And there's it's an art gallery, the whole length.
It's a huge art gallery, isn't it? I mean, I've sometimes thought if one were to take all these windows out and display them in a single-story building, so you could look each one in the eye, it would be a massive building.
It really would. Stained glass is the great unknown gallery. I mean, Victoria and Albert Museum has got a lot of windows, which I think ought to be returned to the churches they came from. But it is extraordinary, because then at least you can look at it close up and see what they were trying to do. My St Mary's Shrewsbury, which I think is one of the great churches with St Neots and one or two others in England, where you can actually study the stained glass, and they are just magnificent.
Whenever we have scaffolding in here or a cherry picker or something, it's it's a bit of a treat to see if you can get to climb up and have a look. When we were restoring the organ, all the middle of the organ was taken out, and anyway, there was scaffolding all over it. I did get up and actually was able not only to look one of those angels in the eye on the top, but also look in the windows. It's just astonishing, the amount of detail. And I mean, you must have many times taken a pair of binoculars to look at stained glass windows, and it's absolutely worthwhile here. The amount of detail that's written into these, drawn into the way in which the coloration and the engraving comes out, it's really spectacular and kind of lost as we crick our necks to look up and see it.
It's worth seeing how much blue there is. I mean, blue was very, very valuable. So if you wanted to look rich, you didn't put gold on, you put blue on. It comes from Afghanistan, where it came from, but it had to come from a long way away. So it was a sign of the wealth of the sponsors of the chapel, the king, in effect.
Yes.
That they had lots of blue.
Especially wealthy as he was dissolving the monasteries at the time.
That's right.
And that's where a certain amount of the money came to adorn this place. We're talking about Henry VIII, but let's go back a little bit, because the building was effectively completed after Henry VII's arm was twisted when he came up to Cambridge for a Garter service, which was held in the old King's College Chapel, the one that's no longer here. And next to it, of course, is this half-built place. And Margaret Beaufort and Provost Argentine sort of took him to one side and said, come on, we can't let this disgrace continue forever. And so it was that Henry VII came up with some money and the building was finished. And here we are in this extraordinary Tudor chamber.
And your eye is just drawn to the ceiling.
Yeah.
I mean, once you got your eye off the windows, particularly during the day, you just see this. I just think it's one of the most extraordinary sights in architecture in Europe, that ceiling. And it's the sense of movement. You feel. I say, is it people waving a fan, or is it some sort of ladies dancing with big sort of hoops, skirts underneath them? But either way, John Westall, who designed it, and I must say, can you think this being designed without any mechanical instruments at all? And he produced this ceiling, which is just amazing. You can't take your eye off it.
No, and a few years ago we installed lights here, so it's even on a dull day like today or after dark, you can still see the vault. And as you say, it's spectacular. It's got movement, and it draws your imagination up, but it also takes it forward, doesn't it, to whichever is the other end from where you're standing.
It's architecture as movement, which you very rarely see. I mean, architecture doesn't move, you hope. But the fan vault, which is an English invention, there aren't many of them in the country. There are more than 24 possibly. They must have been very extravagant to do, or there would have been more of them.
Yes.
It was almost exclusive in churches, all before the Reformation, before the 50s, 30s and so on. But they were simply sensational. I believe people from abroad came and saw them and couldn't work out why they didn't have any. But there they were.
But they didn't export the idea. They didn't take it somewhere else.
No, and they had Plateresque and other sort of proto-Renaissance styles. And the Renaissance was coming in very fast. And Britain's resistance to the Renaissance was a fascinating phenomenon of Tudor architecture. But it was largely the church. And in a sense, it was sort of the church's last throw before the Reformation.
Yes, well, it was, absolutely. And in your recent book on British architecture, you talk about this chapel, but you talk about Henry VII's chapel at Westminster, not in the same paragraph, but in paragraphs next to each other. And I thought it might be interesting just to ask you to offer a little contrast between the two.
Well, they're both sensational.
Yeah.
But I have to say, this wins. I mean, it does win. It's more pure. The pendants at Henry VII's chapel are curious, and you think, what on earth are they there for? They're sort of,
and they're gilded, aren't they?
And they're gilded, and it's a bit flashy. Let's put it that way. But it's an amazing building. I'm not going to do it. And also, it's got a disappointing east window, which does affect it, and it's also quite small. This is sensational in comparison. Yeah.
Yes. I suppose I went to the Abbey fairly recently to have another look at it, and this is clearer as well and cleaner. I mean, there's more glass here. We've got 2 ranks of glass. I think there's only 1 rank there. Also, Fortunately for us, and actually for the world, this glass was never smashed out. The great man Dowsing, who came to clear out all the windows in East Anglia, did visit King's and made a little report of it, but no one carried out his instructions, if indeed instructions they were. Whereas at Westminster, they lost all the windows on that building. So I think that makes a difference. Also, we don't have to have insignia here of the Order of the Bath. It's, so the uprights are much clearer, aren't they?
I didn't realise that was linked to it. But certainly, I mean, the thing in a sense, because you come into this end of the chapel, you come into the Tudor end.
Yes.
And as you can see from the wall panels and so on, it is just enriched beyond belief by carving, whereas the East End is slightly plainer.
Yes.
As earlier.
Earlier, and actually Henry VI was very keen it should be quite plain.
I didn't know that.
No, he had specified that. Yes, without any superfluity, I think, of carvings. I should look up the exact wording and tell you, but definitely a statement that it should be relatively plain. But if we look at this Tudor heraldry here, one of the fantastic things about it is that certainly in the griffins and the greyhounds, there's no repetition. They're all different.
It's extraordinary. One of the things I like about it feeding my preference for Goths, is in a sense the Gothic masons could do what they liked. I mean, almost all churches where you've got a lot of Gothic artistry or sculpture. I mean, Southern Minster, Wells Crossing. You feel that the masons are settling down with their stones, their chisels, and everything. And say, and what should I do today?
Yes.
I know. I met this guy in the market. He's an old friend of mine. I think I'll put him up here.
Yes.
And the freedom, the sense of liberation they had in their architecture. And then the Renaissance comes along and crushes them. So you've got to obey the orders.
Yes. So the college was quite small, I suppose, at the time when this was being put up. And I mentioned Provost Argentine. The next provost was Hackenblen, and it was he who was here when all this work was going on. And I sometimes wonder about how it would have been for him, living in the lodge, which was out towards Great St Mary's from here at the time, and being Dean of Studies as he was, and doing his job. So he would wander onto this building site. What possible control could he have? I mean, and what would his relationship have been with the senior mason?
One just doesn't know. I mean, I think it's probably like relatively primitive societies all around the world, where the priest is in a sense superior to the king, or when operating with the king.
Yes.
I mean, if you're in Mexico City, wherever it was, the temple is the building, and it fulfills that function of demonstrating the power of the king, the wealth of the king, the dominance of the king in the religious life of the nation. I mean, there were only about 40 or 50 students here, I think, at the time, and they couldn't possibly have needed this chapel.
No.
The chapel was an expression of power.
Yes. Yeah. And of course, it was the pre-Reformation world, so the power of the clergy would have been a different sort of thing. Yeah.
Which makes the crossing here so interesting, because this is
green.
This is the Renaissance arriving. It just fits in. I just think it's extraordinary. I mean, somehow or other. And it's interesting that it's not totally Renaissance. In other words, you see some of the panels have got what I'd call Gothic carvings in them, but it's classical in its detailing.
So we're looking at the screen, the triumphal arch in the middle, which was installed at the time of Henry VIII. The organ was added much later. But could you just point out to me what you refer to as the Gothic elements?
By Gothic, I just mean good. What I mean is that the artistry that went into doing it was relatively speaking free. If you look at the coats of arms, they're each different. The panels up there in the coving there, there's things going on everywhere. If you were Palladio, you'd regard that as vulgar and appalling, because you would not allow that. And by the end of the 16th century, I mean, that was completely outlawed. I mean, Inigo Jones said, vulgar, stop it. But here, it's still what I think they call mannerist, and the result is it sort of fuses with the Gothic quite well.
We've got two fusions. We've got the Gibbs building outside, the outside of the chapel, and then we've got this Renaissance screen with the Tudor stonework.
Well, I mean, if you compare that sort of parade here of pillars and architrave with Gibbs, I mean, Gibbs is pure and simple and disciplined and boring.
Yes.
This is fun.
Yeah, this is fun. Let's walk through the fun screen into the inner chapel, where we do walk into a different world quite quickly. This amazingly rich, dark oak stalls.
It is quite breathtaking. And again, it's 16th century rather than 15th. And as soon as you get to the end of the choir stalls, it gets austere almost. All that fun and games stops.
Yes, yeah. Your fun and games stop fairly soon as you go further east. Fun and games stop. Liturgy, of course, begins, which is a form of delight. Although I've never heard it described as fun and games, I don't suppose. But if we could just pause for a moment here. You were with us a fortnight or so ago. You came to the Requiem on Remembrance Sunday, which was the Foray Requiem, and you enjoyed it from this stall here.
I was feeling I was looking at something that had been going on for quite a long time in this sense, and it's beautiful and it's clearly popular and it's maintained by the college and I love it.
Yeah, you're a great church goer, but you're not a church member, as it were.
No, I'm not. I mean, I've. When we launched my book on 1,000 Churches, the Archbishop of Canterbury very kindly gave the launch party in Lambeth Palace, and he asked me how many churches I'd been to, and I said about 2,000 I had to visit.
Yes.
And he looked at me and he said, "You've been to 2,000 churches? I mean, I don't know anyone who's been to 2,000 churches, and none of it rubbed off." He said, and I said, well, I mean, in the introduction, I do discuss what does rubbing off mean, or what did he mean by rubbing off, and I think most people who appreciate the English culture down the years do find churches quite moving places. What does the word mean? And I found in the case of churches, I mean, there were one or two churches I went to where I really thought the church was special. The church were up Marden in Sussex, on a hilltop, a very poor church, and a very sort of hunger-starving place. It must have been terrible in the old days. But you go into that really chapel, and I just was overwhelmingly moved by it. And it might have been time of day, I don't know.
Yes.
But it was the fact that you knew that the people who used that church had climbed up the hill from the farms at the bottom every Sunday. And they were starving people who were always hungry. And they went into that church, and for some reason they thought it was worth it. Yeah, they had to go probably, but they thought it was worth it. That they were promised things in that church which made their life worth living. And that church has represented that promise ever since. And I do find that quite moving.
Yes, I found it moving as well. And I think the consolation and the comfort and the reassurance that people find from engaging somehow within the space of the church in rituals, that adds to life.
I think that's a very important point, and in many ways it's becoming more important rather than less. I mean, it's this awful word well-being, but there's no doubt that people do go to cathedrals in particular in quite large numbers, often on their own, because they want to be somewhere that's beautiful. They can listen to music sometimes, often, and they feel in some sort of sense in communion with something else. I mean, the word spiritual is the word often used nowadays. But they're not church members. I don't know if they believe in God or anything like that. But nonetheless, they find these buildings do give them a response. And I just think that's a wonderful thing about the buildings, and they deserve keeping for that reason.
It is rather strange, isn't it, that people find their spiritual needs met, or the deeper part of who they are welcomed, not by words and people being friendly, but an architectural space filled with beauty.
I think that's very important. I'm doing a book at the moment about loneliness in village architecture and why it appears to be the case that everybody wants to live in a village. If you say, where do you live? We live in Leeds, it's a village really. I mean, there's sort of phrases like that. But what you say is true because on the whole, people tend to say, I find the best solution to loneliness is company.
Yes.
I want other people around me. And there's this famous survey recently that there's nothing people want to do at all, which they'd rather do alone than in company. Even read a book. They want to read a book in company. It's quite extraordinary. But the fact is that they do, other things being equal, like sitting in a church. And they feel spiritually in the presence of something else outside themselves in a church. And I think that's very significant.
Isn't it interesting the way in which some of the English poets of the last century were attracted to churches and spoke of their experiences with churches. I mean, John Betjeman and Philip Larkin particularly.
Well,
I mean, T.S. Eliot as well, of course.
very much. I mean, the three church-loving poets,
Yes.
quite right.
Yeah.
Very different characters, certainly. I always think Larkin got it right. I mean, the word serious,
I do too.
which he uses very sort of deftly. I mean, Betjeman was much more theatrical. I mean, I used to taking around churches. You go into a church, you'd open the
So
door.
sorry, just to clarify, you went round churches with John Betjeman.
With John Betjeman, yes.
Yeah.
And he'd go into a church, and he knew them phenomenally well. But he'd do the little act. He'd open the door, go in, gasp, go down on his knees, cross himself, discuss his doubts, which were considerable, and then sort of point things out. Alec Clifton Taylor, a sort of friend of his, who was another church enthusiast, he'd sort of go into a church and start studying the stone and where it came from. So Betjeman was a bit of a showman as a player.
Yeah.
Larkin was much deeper, and Larkin really was. He was studying churches and asking himself what is different about this building.
And that poem of his on church going, in whose blent air, just every aspect of the experience of standing in a church. I mean, not a spectacular monument like this. We're obviously thinking of a village church. He cycled there. He wants to express reverence somehow or other, so he finds improvises a gesture. But he really does seem to absorb in his sort of atheistic way what you were talking about earlier, about the meaning of churches to people and the way in which the stones accumulate meaning through, endless funerals over the years, burials outside in churchyards, other occasions when people will have gathered, celebrating the seasons in different ways.
Yes, I mean, and Eliot the same. Eliot was very, very serious. I mean, Eliot was actually a friend of my father's, who was a theologian, and they used to correspond, and they met quite often. And it was very much, I mean, what is going on in this building? I mean, Eliot was much more intellectual, I think, but he was also endlessly slightly tortured about Catholicism. Is it Anglicanism, Catholicism, non-conformity? What's going on here? And that would always puzzle him. And Little Gidding, where he's contemplating the splits in the Church of England. But they're all different. But they're three poets who are very challenged by this subject.
But it's great, I think, to connect the poetic and the aesthetic with the religious, and delight with it all coming together for human enrichment. We're walking now through the choir stalls. Of course, always just exciting to see them, because you know that before long the choir will be here again singing. 8 services a week we have, choral services during term. But as we walk towards the East End, so we're coming towards the end of the choir stalls area and the end of the panelling, and then suddenly we have the white stone all around us, which, and as you know perfectly well, this was panelled, but all the panelling was removed and the floor was lowered so that the gift of the Rubens adoration of the Magi could be accommodated. And I just wondered what you made of this arrangement now, which I sometimes think of as kind of 3 rooms in the chapel, the antechapel, the Tudor antechapel, then the stalls area, which is both religious and ceremonial, and then this area here, which is relatively plain and open. It kind of opens up again because it's lighter.
I don't know what to make of it.
Okay.
I mean, you're quite right. I mean, it is very. Until I'm standing here now, I hadn't quite realised how different it was. And it's a pity the panelling's gone, because the panelling warms it and unites it with the rest of the church. But what's curious is that normally when you get to the end of the choir, you get the liturgical bit, sedilia and bits and pieces. Yes, that's right. Well, as it is, it becomes almost a sort of a private chapel. So I don't know. It's curious. I'm always intrigued by these carvings. Do we know anything about these carvings?
They're all defaced, sadly, but not completely removed. Defaced but not removed. But this is obviously, you can see this wheel here. So here we have St. Catherine.
Are those grapes?
Yes, they are, I think, aren't they? Yeah. And the colour, isn't the colour beautiful on all of them? Well, Simon, we've come outside and we're shivering a little bit, but here we are standing at the very west of the chapel, looking at the western elevation, that massive, massive window I see you looking at, and then the great west door And around the west door, what's obviously been restored stonework. I think it was done in the 1980s, 1990s, that sort of time by a local company. And it's actually still looking very clean and pristine, isn't it? I quite enjoy the newness of it.
Well, I mean, when you restore Gothic architecture, you make it look like it did when it was originally built, which is the nice thing about it.
Yeah.
The only thing I worry about this door is that we've got the niches, but nothing in the niches.
I was going to say
I'd
that.
like to know what was in the niches originally. And there's this great antagonism now against filling niches. They'll restore architecture. I mean, the west front of Wells Cathedral was one of the great art galleries of Middle Ages.
Yes.
Hundreds of statues. Most of them were rotted away or gone. And they started replacing them in the 1980s, I think. Yeah. And then they were stopped because everyone was opposing the fact they were putting modern statues in them. They weren't modern, they were copies. But it's a great tragedy, and Wells, I think, suffered as a result. Here, we've just got these empty
two huge niches,
yeah, which in a sense are waiting for somebody. I'd like to know who's going to have the courage to put something in them. But the rest of it, anyway, is marvellous. I mean, the carving has been beautifully restored, and it's so imaginative. You know, each of these natures there, mythologies there, coats of arms there, everything's there, architecture's there. And they had such fun, these architects. Look at the top of the door there. There's some palm trees.
Yeah.
It's in Barnum. It's extraordinary. It's almost Art Nouveau, and I imagine that's original.
It's certainly not new by any means. And if we go a bit closer, if I may, if you look at the very top, you see that there's a sun-like image, and in the middle of that, the tetragrammaton, the Hebrew.
It's Hebrew. You're going to say
Hebrew, and it refers to the name of God.
Yeah.
But isn't that interesting? Because that's where the door opens, so it opens across the middle of that name. That's an extraordinary thing. And then those two, what are those two figures just to either side and below? They very chubby faces with wing-like things coming out.
A couple of noble cherubs, I think, yes.
Noble cherubs.
But you notice just below it all, he couldn't resist H.R., the king.
Yes. Yeah.
He was everywhere.
Absolutely everywhere. So the empty niches is a thing. Actually, we didn't notice them inside, but there are lots inside as well.
Yeah.
Lots and lots. And I just, like you, I wonder who will have the courage, who will have the imagination to think of the way in which these niches might be filled. Not necessarily permanently, but maybe temporarily.
Put the king and queen there, for goodness sake.
Okay. Right now. Okay. There we are. Simon, thank you very much for your time today.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. It really was a pleasure to be able to walk around the chapel with Sir Simon Jenkins. I've been a fan of his book, 1,000 Best Churches, since I got a copy. And I enjoy as well his book on cathedrals. But of course, our college chapel is neither a parish church nor a cathedral, so doesn't feature in either. But what a complete pleasure when he said that this really was his favourite building in the country, and he showed such a warmth towards it and a kind of pleasure in the way in which things have worked out. I mean, the things that I really loved from the conversation were the way in which he put the chapel in the context of the classical Gibbs building, and also saw the Renaissance screen as part of this dance, really, between different styles of architecture, but the way in which he relished in the Gothic, the freedom that the people involved had to make something truly spectacular, sensational was his word, if I remember rightly. That love of creativity in making the skyline, the interior space, the way in which the chapel, because it's so dominated by windows, is very different at night, during the day. But what I'd add as well, it's also really different as the weather changes through the day, as a cloud goes by on a sunny day, and also very different as dawn happens and the sun comes up, or as we more often notice when it becomes dark during the course of a service, which is one of the things that happens actually on Christmas Eve, because it starts at 3 o'clock and ends about 4:30. Often bright sun as we're going in, complete darkness as we come out. So during the course of that amazing service, which people only know from the radio, there's this wonderful light effect as the windows go black. When we were looking at the east end of the chapel, Simon seemed a bit surprised, actually. I don't think he'd been up to that end and looked at it in detail before, at the extent to which the feel and the atmosphere of it is so different because the panelling has been removed. And I noticed that he wasn't really an enthusiast for the way in which it's become. Unlike me, I mean, I really love it, the way it is, with the three rooms, the Tudor hall, the stalls in the middle with a rich dark oak where the choir sings and the ceremonies happen, and then the open bare stone east end, which seemed, although it's been slightly modified over the years, seems still to reflect the desire of King Henry VI, which he expressed in 1448 in a document called his Will and Intent, that the chapel should be in large form, clean and substantial, but setting apart superfluity of two great works of entail and busy moulding. As I say, there are one or two angels and other bits of sculpture at that east end, but largely you get that sense of real austerity and openness. And of course, at that end, it's a very clean acoustic as well, lots of stone. I don't suppose that I could have expected when I invited Simon Jenkins to come along and encounter the chapel with me, that we would end up standing in the middle of it talking about atheism, agnosticism, and poetry. But there we were standing more or less between the choir stalls. And I discovered that, well, his father was a friend of T.S. Eliot, and that he himself used to travel the country with John Betjeman, looking at churches. And I just love that description that he gave of the way in which Betjeman went into a church and did his sort of theatrical response to it and his prayers. And then only after discussing his considerable doubts, as he put it, would the man then start to look at the detail of a church. But wasn't it interesting that he really felt that Philip Larkin was the most significant poet when it came to thinking about church interiors and the atmosphere within churches and what they represent and what they are? I can see why that makes sense to Simon Jenkins. He's a church goer, but not a church member. It was really interesting that he said that George Carey, the Archbishop at the time, had said to him, "You've been to 2,000 churches and none of it has rubbed off." I wonder what that rubbing off means for him, for anyone. I mean, every day we have hundreds of people coming to services here. We don't know why on earth they come, but we know they want to be there. For some, it's the building. For some, it's the music. For some, it's the high point of their visit to Britain or even Europe, to come to a service in this chapel, which they've heard on the radio and know about and have a feel for. But here they come, and so many people, when they leave, say that something special has happened, or they communicate that. They may not say it. They may just put their hands together in a kind of prayer or namaste gesture towards me as they leave, or put their hand on their heart and give a little bow and say a whispered thank you. They know something has happened, that it's a wonderful experience. How that plays into any theology, that's another matter altogether. And to be honest, I'm really open to and hopeful about just leaving the mystery of it all to God, and allowing the building itself to speak of that mystery. But it's a mystery that isn't trivial. And that's why I love the Larkin poem about churchgoing as well. And for me, it's a fitting conclusion just to go back to that poem and just read a few lines from it to conclude this episode. I'd love to return to that beautiful poem by Philip Larkin, which draws us into a real pondering of what churches are about and for. These three lines. A serious house on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognized and robed as destinies.